Hi, this is Dan Klein with the September 2020 EJW podcast. I'm joined today by Karen Horn and Stefan Kolev to speak about the translation of Karl Menger's The Errors of Historicism in German Economics, a very exciting, ambitious project coming out in the September issue. If I can, let me ask you to introduce yourselves. Karen, would you like to begin?
Oh, sure. Happy to be here. I'm currently teaching the history of econ thought at the University of Erfurt. I'm also a former journalist, and I'm also teaching economic journalism. And actually, I live in Zurich, in Switzerland.
Far out. Stefan.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, Dan. I'm Stefan. I live in Zwickau, in the former eastern part of the country. I have a position teaching political economy, which connecting to Menger means all kinds of things in my daily life. I do history economic thought as my main research field, and next to my job, I also am the co-director of the Wilhelm Röpke Institute, doing research on ordoliberalism. And both Karen and I are founding members of the News Network, about which we'll probably talk at some point.
I hope so, I'm sure. But let's first talk about the Methodenstreit. You guys can say it much better. Can you, and I just asked the both of you, I don't know how you want to coordinate, give us an overview about what the Methodenstreit is, what the pieces of it are, the principal players, please.
That's a lot to talk about. Who's supposed to start? Stefan, do you want to? Should I?
Go ahead. I'll join in a second. Yeah.
Methodenstreit is a very odd German word, and actually today it occurred to us that we should have a look and see who used the word for the first time. And as far as I'm concerned, I didn't really find the first source. But anyhow, the German translation of that would be the dispute on method, and it was one in a series of disputes that took place, and that were pretty much a rather German affair, or German and Austrian, all the two were pretty much mixed at the time. And the main opponents in that dispute, which took place in the 1880s, were Karl Menger, who's pretty famous, I think, who lived from 1840 to 1921, and Gustav Schmoller. Gustav Schmoller was more or less his contemporary, 2 years older, and a very important figure in German economics. Menger is known pretty much as the father of Austrian economics. He's known for his theory on marginalism, for his subjective approach and all to value, to his explanation of the value paradox and all these kinds of things. So what happened was that Menger and Schmoller kind of entered into a debate which was not very friendly. Menger had produced a book, his Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre, the Principle of Economics, in 1871, which got him a certain degree of fame. It afforded him a habilitation at the University of Vienna, and he began teaching on that basis. And some 12 years later, he published the second book, which were the Untersuchungen über die Methode der Sozialwissenschaften und der politischen Ökonomie insbesondere. I'll translate that into English. That's the investigations into the method of the social sciences with special reference to economics. This book was one where he focused on methodology. One might say that his main point was that it was necessary to distinguish the historical and statistical study of economics from the theoretical part of economics and from the practical field of application, such as you have it in economic policy and public finance and things like that. He thought that the historical study of economic structures may be useful, may be a sign of knowledge and wisdom, but it was only complementary to theory, and it could not seek to replace it. And when he published that book, it didn't get very much attention. It got some rather friendly echoes, but it wasn't much of a turmoil that was created. But then Gustav Schmoller responded to that. I mentioned Schmoller before. He was the leader of the Younger German Historical School. And he found that Menger went a little bit too far. So he published a review of Menger's piece, of Menger's book, in his yearbook. His yearbook was a very influential review at the time. That review was not very friendly. Schmoller said that essentially Menger went too far, but he also got very personal and said that Menger didn't have the width of erudition that was needed to understand what economics needed, etc. So there was a certain degree of vitriol that entered the debate. And then Menger answered to that review once again, publishing a series of letters, which were not really letters. It's a pamphlet that was written in the form of letters. And in that pamphlet, he responds to Schmoller in a very agitated way. He was really mad. He was really upset. And he writes this booklet to protest against Menger and to protest against Schmoller and to make his points a little bit clearer. Essentially, he doesn't add much to what he already said in the investigations, but perhaps he works out a little bit more in detail what it is about, and that's about separating these three different strands that you can distinguish in the economic discipline, and where he thinks that Schmoller is just putting too much emphasis on history. At this stage,
can you say again what the three strands are according to Menger?
Stefan, maybe you should do that.
So in German economics at the time, and actually well until the late 20th century, you had this traditional division of the discipline in departments of theoretical economics or economic theory, economic policy, which is roughly speaking about the applications of economic theory in the specific institutions of a country, and then public finance. Now, Menger, and I think that is important to understand because this was for a very long time how the field was structured. And so basically they, as we, Karen and I see it, struggle about the demarcation lines, the delimitations of those basically subdomains within what is called Nationalökonomie.
Stefan, I want to make sure you didn't misspeak. Is the third one, you say public finance? Or did you mean, what about econ history then? It's not one of the three strands?
Well, Menger actually has a four-part division where economic history and statistics would also feature. But in that traditional division of the field as in departments, that would be actually part of economic policy, right? So because when you talk about the institutions within a country, you need to describe them, you need to give them some descriptive statistics. So that would make it specific to that particular, to that particular country, right? So that's part of the applied part.
I'll get you. Okay. And so Menger does the letters that are called the errors of historicism in German economics, which are now translated by virtue of you guys. And what happens after that? What are the remaining episodes of the Methodenstreit?
Well,
So
go ahead.
So Schmoller is kind enough, in inverted commas, to publish a letter which he privately sent to Menger in his yearbook. So it's like there are many reviews, and it's like a tiny section, not really a review, where he says, well, I got this booklet, it's nicely produced, looks expensive, so, but it feels already on page one as Karen said, agitated and personal, that I'll not burn it, but I will just send it to the author in a way to basically not destroy such an expensive booklet, which of course is quite an offense. There are many, many publications which Karen and I find in the 1880s, even in the 1890s. So they sort of keep up repeating the argument. Schmoller at some point says, of course, it's like the, how did he put it in English, or how did he translate it into English? The two legs. So we need theory and history like the two legs of a walking man. Also, Menger gets more precise, as I mentioned, regarding the separation, saying, yes, we do need theory, we do need morphology, so that actually is probably also the way to Weber in the ideal times. We do need history and statistics, and we do need applied economic policy. So it's even more subdivided than what I said before regarding the structure of the departments. It cools off, but of course it has implications for the formation of the Austrians and for the further evolution within the historical school. So it's just one battle out of those many Methodenstreits, as they're called, which then follow in the 20th century.
And then Menger publishes another statement about the divisions, I think in the late 80s, but maybe that's not so directed and not so bitter. And that's kind of a restatement of some of his views, yeah. Kind of considered part of the corpus there, but not so much of an engagement, a direct engagement. I see. And so during this time, is basically, my understanding is that Schmoller is gathering influence in German economics and in a sense suppressing Menger's influence. Is that fair to say?
Well, as Karen said, they're both mid-career scholars, right? So if you see, they're like 30-something at that point. And we and also the young scholars who helped us really wondered, what is all that about? So what kind of a weird conversation is that, talking really past each other all the time? Those divisions of economics are actually existed for decades, and can they get more, can they just cool down, talk about the substance? It's not so difficult. And at some point we came up with that hypothesis, or that perhaps they're not talking to each other, but that they're talking to the potential young crowd which could form around both of them, right? So as we know from the Austrian history, that debate becomes formative to basically group.
It's very hard to tell because, well, as Schumpeter has it in his History of Economic Analysis, that a lot of things were involved, and one part of it is personal temperament, and that might also have been the case, that Menger was just a little bit too easily hurt, and Schmoller was, I don't know, a little bit nasty. But that's really a little bit difficult to judge for us nowadays. And I also am not sure I like the theories about their, exaggerating their stance because they're catering to an audience. I don't think you plan these things ahead. It's just something you stumble into, and then it unfolds. And they definitely hurt each other. And what I find more interesting perhaps, and also more important, is what they did to the discipline, the rift in the discipline between the two fields, one of which was more interested in not only in history but also in institutions and in culture and in mentalities and how they evolve on the one hand, and the other that tried to work out very abstract laws of economics, ultimately going in the direction of Mises' Aporiorism. This rift really becomes very clear due to this debate, and gets even sharper afterwards, and that is perhaps not something to applaud. It's probably sad that it went this way, because I think that both can actually benefit from each other. You need history in order to come up with the categories that you need in abstract thinking, and abstract thinking is needed to sort out what historical research should look after. So the two should actually work together, and to have caused this rift is probably a sorry effect of this kind of dispute, I would think.
That's fascinating. So does Menger have followers in the immediate decades that really try to develop something they call theory quite abstractly? And what does that abstraction look like? Does it look like Mises already? Or is it model building? Or is it not really like that? Is there not really someone who does that?
So of
You know
course,
what I mean? Go
I
ahead,
mean, we
Stefan.
can mention Yannick Wasserman's recent book, which I think in that section is really wonderful to show the plurality of people, either Menger's age or somewhat younger. Of course, the usual suspects who come to mind are Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser, but there are many more. And of course, within the Austrian tradition, we are used to the division of the Böhm-Bawerk branch and the Wieser branch. It could be important in the sense that indeed the Böhm-Bawerk branch might indeed go into the more abstract direction, whereas Wieser, especially from 1900 onwards, tries to accommodate both economic theory and institutions as seen from his theory of power. So it could be that is one way to look at it. But again, the number of people working in Prague, in other universities in today's Czech Republic, smaller places in Austria, but also some people in Germany who side with Menger is quite a sizable crowd. So I wouldn't put them into those boxes. I think the plurality of that landscape is actually quite interesting and quite important to look at, instead of having lines and dynasties and sub-dynasties. Yeah.
So if you were to ask Böhm-Bawerk in whatever 1890, like, what do you think of that dispute between those two guys? Would he just sort of say, "Oh, I'm with Menger, and I believe in the importance and meaningfulness of those separations"? Or do you think?
So he has a very positive review of Menger's investigations, which he didn't need to make because he was not Menger's student anymore. He already had his position in Innsbruck. I think everybody understands and understood what Karen said, right? That those are not substitutes but complements, right? So it really is about a division of labor. So some people will be better at the one, others will be better at the other. You need people who are, of course, interfaces. So otherwise, you get groups who cannot talk to each other. I think, of course, Böhm-Bawerk. So I think nobody was blind to the overheated and, in the end, unfruitful character of the debate. But you would just have people who specialize on the one or on the other.
And then they trade and talk and work together.
Yeah. Or on being the interface, which I think is also quite important too.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I think Karen put it really well. But let me turn to Karen just. So, I mean, what would Menger say about that? I mean, is that sort of Menger improved that Menger himself didn't say nicely and simply enough? You know what I mean? Like, is Menger wrong?
I think it's just a matter of degree. Everything is just something relative. Menger's point is just that people like Schmoller and Roger, for that part, are doing too much history and too much senseless history, let's say. But he's not denying the utility of a historical approach to economics, like in any social science. He's not denying that. And Schmoller, at the same time, is not denying the necessity of theory. He's just thinking that so the phenomena in the economic world are so complex that it doesn't make sense to reduce them to pure forms. What you need is to take into account the complexity of the influences that come together, etc. So I think that they both know that the other one has a point, and both do not really want to enter a war. I have seen many instances where I get the feeling that what Menger actually wants is to be part of this greater German tradition, and he just craves being being part of that, instead of sort of distinguishing himself from that. At some point, it's too late. It's clear that he cannot be a family member of Schmoller's anymore, and then of course he goes into his own direction. But I think at the beginning the idea is not to start something new, to make a revolution of sorts. The idea is just to sort of correct marginally the direction of research in with the idea in mind that something more abstract is needed, that something a little bit less arbitrary is needed. When you look at the work that some of these members of the historical school are doing, it's just pure data collecting without any idea behind it where this might be leading. And that he is uneasy with that is something I can really understand. But it's not such a clear-cut difference in their points of views.
I'm very attuned to seeing, and maybe too attuned to seeing conflicts and battles in political sensibilities in things, and that's certainly got a place here.
Sure.
With Menger being, correct me if I'm wrong, essentially a Smithian classical liberal, and Schmoller being a democratic socialist or social democrat. I'm not quite sure what best way to describe it. And how does that figure in here, would you say?
Well, I'll say a couple of words, but Stefan also has his point of view on this. My impression is that, well, again, the differences aren't that large. Menger, in a later piece, explains that actually they share a lot of the goals. He shares, and his disciples share a lot of the goals of the Katheter Sozialisten, the most socially democratically feeling economists like Schmoller, that is basically, like in Smith, about the life of the poor and bettering the condition of the poor. So economics as a discipline is not one that especially caters to capitalists. And it's not that. And Menger makes that pretty clear in the piece that Stefan has translated together with Erwin Decker a couple of years ago. He makes it clear in that essay, but he also makes it clear in other instances, and that's one of the typical prejudices one comes across when you think about classical liberals in the Smithian tradition and others more socially inclined. That's for Menger is that, and then also Schmoller has read his Smith too. The historical school has understood a lot of the writings of Adam Smith. But so has Menger, because that in another instance, I think it's in the investigations, Menger writes about Smith not believing in the spontaneous evolution of institutions and just being a constructivist, basically. Well, no, that's nonsense, of course. But that happens in those days. People misinterpret, people don't look closely. That, as I said, that happens. So I think that even there, they might have a different label. Menger considers himself more liberal, and Schmoller has cast him himself in the social democratic group. But the differences are not that vast. I don't sense them as being really that important. It's just more a question of branding. Stefan, how do you see that?
Well, in quite similar terms. I think both of them, I wouldn't use the term third way, but I think both of them are or searching for some middle ground, being between some, let's say, Marxian type of revolutionary ideas which are coming up, of course, at the time, on the one hand, and on the other hand, that strange term, Manchesterianism, which both of them actually decline. As the proximity to social democracy, I really think we should be careful, because social democracy at the time is pretty broad, right? So you still have, well, it's basically coming up, and you have all kinds of branches, some more revolutionary, some more reformist. But I think it is, I see both of them actually also in the way they are writing, probably not in the piece which we translated, as reformers and as, if you want to say, moderates who are both worried about the transitions which Europe is going through the time. They both have a sensibility for sensitivity to the socially weak. So the social question is important for both of them. Both of them are, of course, attached to their respective empire and to its policy making. So none of them is like an outsider to the policy of Germany or Austria-Hungary. I think both of them want to avoid a revolution of the Marxist type. Both of them are certainly not conservative, so they do see the dynamics of capitalism as something which just has to be embedded in frameworks which make that gigantic transition which society is going through livable, right? So in that respect, I don't see them as fundamentally different, right? So Schmoller is depicted as the statist who supports the Prussian state. Well, Menger was, of course, also very close to Austrian politics, up to the crown prince, but not only, right? So none of them is like the libertarian who hates his or the other one state.
Yeah, it's interesting how Menger is a favorite among, he's like a favorite among people who also have the favorite of Friedrich Bastiat. But I did a poll. It was kind of an interesting result. I think Menger himself would have been surprised. But anyway, so look, everybody cares about the good of the whole. Everyone is responsible to aligning their thoughts and actions and conducts to that. That's what virtue is about. And of course, a lot of people accuse different people of not being that, and so on. So I agree that they're the same that way, and Menger has to kind of fight off these misattributions about what's going on. But when it gets to public policy, how much different, or politics for that matter, in their day, how much different are they? I mean, maybe I'm kind of guessing that Schmoller was for governmentalization of social affairs more than he really was, and that Menger was resisting that impulse. Am I wrong in that? I mean, I don't really know, because Schmoller's not translated. I haven't read any Schmoller. But that's my impression. That's my impression of the organization that he led. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I think of that as sort of part of the progressive movement worldwide. And I do think I know what the progressives were about in America. Any takers?
Let me start perhaps with an anecdote. I mean, if you say the one is bottom up, but the other one is elitist and close to the state, Menger at some point in our text accuses Schmoller that actually his bad rhetoric is because he was advising basically some workers' clubs or associations, and out of basically those discourses with normal people, he got his bad language, right? So in that respect, you can actually see those stereotypes of the two which we have as reversed. I think the question is to a certain extent difficult because, as you said, or as you implied, Schmoller had a powerful device of the Verein für Sozialpolitik, which, as an association of lots and lots of people, had lots of institutional power, so they could produce lots of reports, lots of both collecting data and recommending how policy should be done. Whereas in the Austrian context, such a society existed at some point, but it never got the traction which it had in Germany. So I think we should also distinguish, or we should also say that Schmoller was certainly not the only one in his generation who in that sense was politically influential, right?
What did those reports tend to say? Did they sound more like the Cato Institute or the Brookings Institute? Did they sound more like the Fabian Society or the Property Defense League in Britain, which I think was operating at that time in England? So what did those reports tend to say in terms of what policy and politics should do? Do you know?
So I know about one which Weber wrote, which was on the on the agrarian processes in the eastern part of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, as the school at that point, first of all, of course, about collecting data, etc., etc. And then you could draw very different consequences from that. And basically, out of those involvements of collection of data, policy recommendation, they were got into that, we know about value freedom, that at some point that got too intermingled and accused Schmoller of mingling his value judgments into the whole debate. So Schmoller has this idea that basically there can be value judgments produced by himself, which somehow mirror not so much the state, but really society, like some he calls it an average value judgment. And by that, that should be the position of the state. So it's actually, you can say, not so much top down. So what the state says is correct, but basically it's the attempt to have a pluralist society and nevertheless to know what that society has as a general well-being. That would be perhaps a way to take it. But of course it was difficult. I mean, if you ask different groups in that society, in many ways they could have irreconcilable value judgments. So they were struggling with that issue. What do you do with the data, right? And who is it that, can there be policy proposals who are beneficial for all? What do you do with losers? Mm-hmm. But again, let me say one final thing on that, which is that you have a society which is going through the most fundamental transition in, let's say, in the past couple of 100 years. So country which is catching up with a velocity unprecedented so far. So all of them are struggling what to do with that society so that it doesn't get into onto a, let's say, a Marx-like trajectory. So we shouldn't impute too much strategy on them. They have just the same difficulties of struggling with their globalization, I think, as we do with ours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you want to add, Karen? You're good?
Yep.
Okay. This term Manchesterism gets brought up. I recall it particularly in the essay that Karen alluded to, an essay that Menger wrote on, I guess it was if I'm not mistaken, the 100 years of Smith's death. Is that right, mm-hmm. Stefan? Yeah.
Yep.
And so it was like a tribute to Smith and how Smith relates to these kinds of issues that are going on in German economics at the time. And I mean, they both, I mean, I gather that people accuse Menger of being a Manchester person, a Manchesterism. And he says, I'm not a Manchesterism. He just sort of says, I'm not, as though he agrees about the definition of the term. But I find that really interesting, and I'm really curious about it. I gather that Manchesterism was a term that meant sort of a very rigid, laissez-faire, free market kind of attitude. What I find kind of odd about that is that I don't think of Cobden and Bright and Gladstone as being very rigid about those things. In fact, they were all working politicos. So I just wonder if you can comment. And do you think there's a sort of parallel here to the word neoliberal, where it's basically a term of abuse that opponents kind of ill-defined and then put all sorts of stuff they don't like in there? Is there some parallel there?
That's exactly the way how we see it. It seems to be just a pejorative term. And Menger writes this essay to make clear that the reason why people are doing economics basically is because we're interested in the wealth of nations and the wealth of those who are the poorest part of these nations. But he needs to explain it because at some stage before that, the idea has set in that isn't quite the case, and that economists tend to be partisan, and that they tend to be partisan with big money, with capital interests, etc. And that's an issue that comes up regularly, and it is a common staple even in these days, and it's very difficult to explain. sometimes I think that this may be due to the fact that some people sometimes forget to say that this is a concern, and then this image might sort of stick with some people, that if you always argue in our days for lower taxes and for, I don't know, for more freedom, less regulation, et cetera, and you might just be catering to your own interests. But the fact that this is actually something that is supposed to serve the general interest is something that we have to explain and we have to repeat over and over. Otherwise, other people will forget about that. And that's what Menger does here. I think it's easier for people like Schmoller, who constantly talk about the social question and who constantly bring it up. But it's basically a matter of communication and of framing, as one would say nowadays. But it's important to make that point. Economics has no sense if it's not about creating equal conditions in a way, because people are natural equals, as we know from Adam Smith and as we have taken from it. And so our concern should be with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Stefan?
I think there is another, I think, similarity between the usage of Manchesterian and of neoliberal, which basically is void of institutions, right? So you believe in some magical self-coordination of everything, which doesn't need frameworks, right? As we know, this is wrong for the ones who call themselves neoliberals in the 30s. And as you mentioned, this might equally be wrong for the ones who perhaps call themselves Manchesterians. I'm not that knowledgeable of the 1840s, but I think that is important, right? So to what extent does the functioning of self-organization in economy and society has prerequisites? And Manchesterian and neoliberal mean, see, those are those stupids who believe that it has none. I think that might be an important parallel.
Yeah, right. And again, it's a question of, is it just a misattribution? I think it might be fair to say that there's some grounds for saying that a lot of whatever, let's say, classical liberals and libertarians are too weak on preconditions and institutions, but that doesn't mean that adversaries don't greatly overstate it and generalize about such things, which brings us back to the classical liberals having to sort of deny what they're being charged with, just like the concern for the poor and the good of the whole, which is so clear in Adam Smith. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm sure there's other things for us to talk about. I kind of wonder what does Schmoller's career look like after the 1880s? Maybe you said something about that, but I'm kind of curious to where, his influence, his standing. Did he succeed in the institution building and the influence he was trying to have?
Karen, or should I?
Well, not in the short run. Well, as Stefan mentioned before, we had a series of strides, of disputes, and the next dispute, of course, is the Werturteilsstreit, the dispute on value judgments. And there, Schmoller really loses some of his influence, and he loses especially Sombart and Weber. Now, whether in the longer run it was really Menger who was more successful may be debatable. I think if you look at the current state of economics, it's a little bit a mixture of the two. Mainstream economics has become very technical. Now, that's not something that Menger was especially in favor of. It has become not very interested in history and in institutions, but then of course there are these branches where that does take place and where that does play a role, and I think Schmoller would again be very, very, very interested in that. So the two actually stand, in my point of view, for what they really wanted and what they really wrote for. They stand for something that we nowadays consider heterodox. The economic mainstream with the neoclassical trend in the middle is not exactly what Menger was after, and of course it is not what Schmoller was after. So the two have sort of drifted to the outskirts of the general
they're both
trend.
heterodox today, as it were.
Yes. And one tends to divide the two strands between subjectivism and objectivism. That wasn't really their dividing line, even though you can read it very often. The same is true for the distinction between induction and deduction. Both actually wanted a bit of both. So that also is not the dividing line that survives until this day. And this day we actually mix the two. We use whatever we can. There's a lot of, and anything goes.
I want to ask you before, Karen.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a kind of disagreement with Weber on value judgments. So Schmoller mixed it up with Weber on something about value judgments.
That's a question to ask
Stefan.
He is
Okay.
really the Weber guy.
I mean, I know Weber wrote about that, but I didn't know that Schmoller was maybe one of the interlocutors there. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, very much so. So it all started in the very early 1900s, and it erupted in Vienna in 1909 at a meeting of the Verein, even though there were skirmishes before that. So the question is indeed, already in the Methodenstreit, what should economists do? What should economists legitimately do? And Schmoller, as I mentioned before, by his intent to also shape public policy with his pronouncements, was not very keen at separating his positive analysis from his value judgments, and again was struggling to find a concept of value judgments which he found sort of universal by averaging the different value judgments in society. So Weber first thought that type of value judgments cannot exist, but above all that one should be very careful not to do precisely what Schmoller was doing, meaning mixing the positive and the normative. So Schmoller actually was the main object, or let's say the main bone of contention when Weber and Sombart and that generation started the debate on value judgments, which of course had also other layers. They were the youngsters who wanted to emancipate themselves, but certainly that type of policy advice, which claimed to be scientific, but in Weber's eyes was not, was the object of attacking in that second debate. Let me say about the success of Schmoller and of that type of economics we associate with him. I think the standard Austrian story that Menger just won, right, is a little bit simplistic in a couple of ways. So to begin with, the old institutionalists in the US were heavily influenced by, not just by Schmoller, but basically by that type of economics which I studied in Germany. The American Economic Association was founded as a copy, literally, a copy of the Verein, if you read Richard Illy's presidential address. I'm currently having a project on the business cycle institutes in the interwar period, one of them being a Russian statistician working in Bulgaria. So you can actually see that Russia, which was, as many other peripheral countries, catching up countries like the US or Southern Europe, heavily influenced by the historical school, that you get a very sophisticated theoretical statistics blooming within the historical school. So what we would call today econometrics has its beginnings in that age. It's not that they were just collecting data, but they were really thinking about methods, what to do with those quantitative piles of data. They were also very much debating all the time state capacity. So what can the state do? What is the division of labor of the state? And unions, which can be seen, of course, as bottom-up organization. So all of those are topics which we discuss until today. And that's why I don't think we can say that the Austrians won. But basically everybody, both of them had a big impact. Schmoller's Jahrbuch, as that journal was called after 1908, was until the mid-1930s one of the main international journals of economics globally, right? So I think he was successful in his own ways. And yeah, that I think is important to underscore.
Yeah, so go ahead, Karen, please.
Yeah, there's another thing if you look at a somewhat longer time frame that I find relevant, and that is that the German Ordo Liberals, with Walter Eucken as the key figure, actually started as members of the historical school, and Eucken wrote his dissertation on the nitrogen supply in Germany. I mean, he just collected data. That's exactly what Menger said that the Schmoller guys were doing, and these people noticed over time that that was not enough and that theory was needed, and Eucken always thought that he was the one who was able to build a bridge between the two by coming up with his how do you say that in English, Stefan? His strip of
the great antinomy, the ideal types, basically. Weber and
it's like ideal types of economic systems, which he classifies, which he describes, and he builds a bridge between history, economics, and philosophy. He just tries to overcome the rift between Schmoller and Menger in a certain sense. That is, I think, a very fruitful approach that is not anymore, but that needs further elaboration, perhaps.
I know Hayek had great respect and I think gratitude for Eucken. Now, did Eucken move ideologically? Was he different in politics at age 25 and age 40? Sorry, I'm not letting this go. Can anyone answer that question?
Yes, we can answer that in detail, which I think is perhaps
it's a different
might be too much of detail. Yeah.
Well, a yes or no will do. A yes or no will be a start. He was different.
He did, just as Weber did, and so yeah, absolutely, yeah. He did.
All right. So,
but I think
go ahead.
What your subtext is.
I don't want it to be sub. Go, Karen. Go, Karen. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wouldn't think he was the axis along which he probably very much changed his point of view was not one regarding the question of whether social policy was important or not, whether it was important to be a liberal or not. I don't. What I think where he changed a lot was on the issue of nationalism and of, well, conservatism, these kinds of things. But that's something that is a different, as I said, it's a different axis than the one between the historical school and the more Mengerian type economics.
Did he get caught up with Nazism?
No. But no, he didn't. He was an opponent. He was one of the members of the German resistance. But he came from origins that were slightly nationalistic. That's something that was quite typical in his days, and he was very shocked by the Versailles Treaty, and he was very eager to find some kind of revenge for what was done in that treaty. But then over time he sort of sobered up and learned, and he really became a liberal in it, even also in the political sense. That's what some historians often say, that he was never a political liberal in the sense that he didn't understand what democracy was about. That's mistaken.
Yeah. That's not true. And he's very important in bringing the Ordo Liberals forward, right? And inspiring the Ordo Liberals. All right, so look, I want to go back and kind of go back to my main point and ask you, and let me just develop a little bit. So, I mean, you're associating, right, Stefan did, I think, Schmoller's operations as kind of parallel to Eli and the AEA. And we know how much that was a progressive kind of project to a great extent. And the historical school in the U.S. with folks like Commons who are also part of that. So I mean, I still kind of figure and think that there's this ideological undercurrent to all of this, or maybe it's not even under, but a current to all of this. And you know, I see the trajectory of econ going back from the 18th century is that out of the Smithian period, out of the Adam Smith period, say, some notions of basic econ theory, if you like, understanding, argumentation, becomes very identified. These are the impressions one gets, especially if you read Frederick Bastiat, with liberal outlook, with a kind of, allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way, to use Adam Smith's words, kind of outlook. And so that there's never mind axioms and whatever, but there's kind of a body of, free market argumentation. And it shouldn't be overstated, and it shouldn't be rigid, and it shouldn't be thought of, I don't think, as, a priori or whatever that means, apodictic or whatever. And so there's a connection there with the idea of theoretical economics and liberal outlook. And I can't help thinking that, underneath all this, which we see elsewhere, and we see everywhere really in this period, of a kind of wanting to undermine to some extent the authority that liberal theorizing has. I think we see it in the US. I think you see it in Sweden. In Sweden, Myrdal makes an attack on his professors like Heckscher and Cassel. And that was very openly ideologically. In a way, I think I like Myrdal better than I would like Schmoller, because he's very upfront about what he's about anyway. So I can't help thinking that the Schmoller camp, as it were, they don't really so much have a body of alternate theory to turn to and sort of fight as our theory versus your theory. They're more, I think, trying to, this is like my reading, my conjecture, if you like diminish the authority of the Menger types, if you like, the kind of liberal presumption types, and by saying, it depends so much on circumstances and everything's particular and you can't generalize, you need to understand. And, we got to get, and once we get all of our guys and all of the professorships, they'll come up with the right historical stories. I mean, I don't think he's thinking this so cynically, but, I do think this is maybe the way it would actually cash out. And so that's kind of my view of like my suspicion about what is the sort of underlying impulse of the whole thing. And I think that Menger is a little bit silly in trying to draw these distinctions between the theory and the policy and the history and so on. I don't think that cashes out, just like Karen said at the beginning, in a sensible way. I think Smith represents good attitudes about those different, veins. And actually, it's actually all feeding into each other, because I see the theoretical claims as sort of abbreviated generalizations with by and larges in them that form presumptions, you could say. So any reactions to what I just said by either of you?
So I think we should be a little bit careful in discussing liberalism in the German context at the time. So obviously, the year Menger publishes his principles is the year when Germany unifies. A couple of years before, Austria is defeated, so it's not part of that game. So I think if you want a political story which is underlying what might be happening, it really is the question how those two new empires, until then there was just one, have some issues to basically dominate Central Europe and things like that. I think it is important to understand that even if you say, so the big question really in German liberalism is what does nationalism mean with regard to liberalism? And of course, in the Austrian context, that means quite a bit, something quite different as compared to the German context at the time. So I think we should be careful to use those categories, which we know from stable countries or stable nation states like France or England, and to impose them on Germany and Austria at the time. Especially, I think that is something which perhaps we should mention, even though it's easy to track and widely known. I mean, Menger dedicated his principles to Rorschach, the founding father of the older historical school. And Rorschach and his generation basically would agree with pretty much everything we said about Smith. They were just curious to what extent the big disagreement was actually not about Smith, if I may add, but about Ricardo, right? So the question always was, starting with Rorschach, probably even starting with List, to what extent do we have a differentiated order of the economy which can be theorized as Ricardo theorized his economics? And what do we do in countries where that order does not exist, right? So where basically politics is still all over and we don't have an economy which is a distinct suborder of society. So that's really a big issue. And that's why the historical school was so powerful in Russia, in the US, in Southern Europe, in Japan, because those were countries where the political notions and the role of the economy, the place of the economy in society was very different from England or France. By that, I like your question. I wish we could say that Schmoller was more statist or he wanted less liberalism. I don't think that is true, precisely because the notions of liberalism and the role of the economy was so different in Central Europe if you compare it to Western Europe at the time.
Okay.
And also some of these disputes are really about economics. They're really about an approach. I don't think it's always helpful to think that academic disputes are driven by politics. Politics are maybe somewhere in the background, but actually Menger's pieces are not very political. He's trying to make his analytical point, and Schmoller responds to that. I think they might have had their disputes on politics elsewhere, but it's not in the foreground here. What really matters here is trying to find a way to define this field, to find an answer to the question, what should economists do? Someone else put it so nicely, and they're helping us today understand what this field is all about and how many ways you have in dealing with it and what kind of approaches can be helpful. But that way isn't exactly defined at this stage, and that's what they're fighting on. I think one shouldn't overburden the historical look at it with politics.
I love overburdening things.
Sure.
So tell us about the translation project, because it wasn't really just you two who did the translation, right?
Oh no. Well, this is a project in the framework of our network of news, and news is an international interdisciplinary academic network that was started in Germany, but now has members in the US like yourself, in Sweden like yourself, and in many other countries. There's something like 80 members that teach economics, philosophy, politics, and history, and other fields in various places. And then we also have a network for young affiliates, for young academics who are, we hope, going to have a career in academics at some point. So these two levels of academic people are tied together in this network, and what we try to do is to foster a debate between the disciplines and between the continents. And as you can see in this instance, this is something where an important text wasn't available in English, and so at News we consider that it is helpful to foster the debate. And one of the ways how you can do that is through producing translations which will enable us to read the texts and to analyze them together. Let me just say one line on Adam Smith. One of the reasons why Adam Smith was misunderstood in the German context for so long was a matter of translation too, and we strongly believe that it is important to read the original texts and not just Reader's Digest versions, as was also in the case with Smith, whose reception went through France and the Reader's Digest version and a rearrangement of his argument. That must be avoided in order to have a true appreciation of what a theory really stands for, and that's one of our aims at News. Stefan will tell you more about the process itself, because he basically organized it.
Please.
So, well, then it was Dan's idea that we should do that. But again, it's more than 90 pages, so how do you do that? I cannot sit down and translate 90 pages of 19th century German with lots and lots and lots of lingual ambiguities. So Diana Thomas, also a member of News, provided us with the very first letters of the book. And then we, meaning Karen and I and Clemens Schneider, we decided that we could ask our young affiliates if they were willing to invest substantial efforts in translating, roughly speaking, 2 letters per person. They did it. They produced very good text, but of course that requires lots and lots of further editing. So there were three young affiliates in Prague, 2 of them American, 1 German, PPE students in Prague, who did the first homogenization of the texts, and very helpful in terms of also pointing to Karen and me, how we should proceed and what other fields of editorial efforts are necessary. So Corona, the age of Zoom and Skype, we spent lots of time on Zoom and Skype, and so you were very helpful to give us final edits, and now Jason Briggeman. So yeah, well, in the end, we hope it will be a readable text. Of course, we always struggled with that perennial question of how close do we stay to the text? Do we cut sentences which are 6 lines long into separate sentences? What do we do with terms which are borderline unclear? So we hope the readers will enjoy it, and we hope that, as Karen said, it will be a News project which bridges German legacy in intellectual history and English-speaking readers who today don't speak the language anymore.
And in this way, 20 men produce a pin.
We also have a follow-up project.
Tell us.
Yeah, well, that's the infamous or famous Schmoller review that we mentioned earlier, because that's also not available in English. And in order to understand whether Menger really had a reason to react or not, it might be helpful to have that text in English. So that's ongoing.
That's great. That's great. I don't know what your publication plans are, but I would be interested to know.
No, I'm the co-editor of Schmoller's Jahrbuch as it is today, and I think publishing that piece should be in Schmoller's Jahrbuch. So okay. I appreciate it, but we thought he would like it to see it in his journal.
That's fine. All right, guys. Well, fantastic. Are there any final remarks you'd like to make?
Oh, I would like to thank you for the idea, which initially struck me as overambitious, but then crowd translating, as we called it, seemed to work just as fine as crowdfunding and other things. I would like to thank the young affiliates. I would like to thank Diana for providing us with the first letters, and certainly Karen. That was lots and lots of final editorial work. But especially, again, the young affiliates who, out of their inspiration for PPE and Austrian economics, of course, but mostly PPE, were willing to invest so much time.
Far out. Karen, can you say the URL of News?
Can I say what?
The URL.
It's very easy. It's www.news, like N-O-U-S. News is Greek and stands for mind and spirit. So www.news.network. That's it. Okay. And then you'll see that we're both a platform and a search engine and element for advertising new events and business careers and scholarships and all kinds of things. You'll see.
Awesome. Well, guys, thanks very much. I'm going to turn the recording off. Thank you again, but you guys stay on. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan.